From a fancy collar business, to a bronze angel that isn't actually an angel, to a night the whole thing went completely dark for the first time in a century. This is the entire history of Piccadilly Circus. And spoiler, the most famous circus in London has never had a single clown, a single elephant, or a single ringmaster. But it does have neon, chaos, and enough scandal to make a Victorian blush. Let's start at the very beginning, back when this whole area was just mud, farmland, and one guy selling ruffled collars. Because back in the early 1600s, a tailor named Robert Baker made a small fortune selling stiff, ruffled collars called piccadills. Basically, the fashionable neck torture device of the day. And Baker built himself a mansion with the profits, which locals mockingly nicknamed Piccadilly Hall. Rude but accurate, because this dude quite literally built his career on collars. And somehow, that nickname stuck to the entire neighborhood for the next 400 years. So next time you're standing in Piccadilly Circus, just remember, you're standing on the legacy of one guy's fancy neckwear. Absolute legend. But the circus part didn't show up until 1819, when architect John Nash designed the junction as part of his grand plan to connect Regent Street to the rest of London. And circus in this case just means a circular road junction, from the Latin word for, well, circus. No lions, no trapeze artists, just 5 roads slamming into one roundabout. Nash envisioned it as an elegant, symmetrical junction, lined with matching buildings. Very classy, very orderly. But if you know anything about London, you already know that plan was doomed from the start. Because within decades, the elegant symmetry got completely obliterated. Shaftesbury Avenue was carved through in 1886, wrecking Nash's perfect circle and turning it into the lopsided, chaotic mess we know today. So much for architectural perfection. But hey, at least they gave us something to make up for it. Because in 1892, the 7th Earl of Shaftesbury died, and Londoners decided he deserved a memorial. And what they built next has been confusing tourists for over a century. In 1893, the Shaftesbury Memorial Fountain was unveiled, topped with a bronze statue everyone calls Eros, the Greek god of love. Except here's the twist. It's not Eros. The sculptor, Alfred Gilbert, actually intended it to depict Eros, the god of requited love, or selfless love, as a tribute to Lord Shaftesbury's philanthropy. But somewhere along the way, the public just decided it looked like Eros, and the nickname stuck harder than Robert Baker's collars. Poor Eros, 130 years of being mistaken for his own brother. That's gotta sting. And speaking of stinging, the statue's unveiling didn't exactly go smoothly either. Because Victorian London took one look at a nude bronze figure perched above a public fountain and had a full-blown moral meltdown. Newspapers called it indecent. Critics said it was inappropriate for a memorial to a respected philanthropist. And the fountain itself kept malfunctioning, spraying passers-by instead of politely trickling. So the beloved London icon started life as basically a wardrobe malfunction with extra steps. Off to a great start. But while Victorians were busy being scandalized by a statue, the area itself was about to get a much bigger glow-up. Because by the early 1900s, Piccadilly Circus became ground zero for a brand new obsession, illuminated advertising. In 1908, the first electric advertising signs went up, lit by thousands of bulbs, and it completely changed the character of the place overnight. What used to be a fairly refined Regency junction turned into London's flashiest billboard, and honestly, nobody could look away. By the 1910s and 20s, massive glowing signs for Bovril, Schweppes, and Guinness towered over the circus, and Londoners nicknamed it the hub of the universe. Which is a pretty bold claim for a traffic roundabout, but sure, go off. Tourists started flooding in just to see the lights, and Piccadilly Circus essentially became London's answer to Times Square, before Times Square had even fully figured out what Times Square was. Not bad for a spot that started as one guy's collar mansion. And it wasn't just adverts that changed the circus, because underground, an entirely different transformation was happening. In 1906, Piccadilly Circus Station opened as part of 2 brand new London Underground lines, and within just 2 decades, it was already bursting at the seams. So in 1928, Engineers completely rebuilt the station from scratch, creating a massive circular subterranean concourse ringed with shops, lit by a dramatic domed ceiling. At the time, it was considered one of the most modern transport hubs on Earth. Basically, while Londoners were gawking at the neon signs above ground, an entire glowing shopping mall was quietly being built beneath their feet. But then World War II happened, and the party got shut down real quick. Because starting in 1939, Britain enforced strict blackout regulations to protect cities from German bombers using lights as targets. So every single one of Piccadilly's famous glowing signs went dark. The hub of the universe became just another shadowy junction in a city bracing for the Blitz. And it wasn't just dark, it was dangerous, because the circus and surrounding area took real bomb damage during the war, like most of central London did. Rough couple of years for our favorite roundabout. The statue itself didn't escape the chaos either. During the war, Eros, or rather Antiros, was actually taken down entirely and placed into storage for safekeeping, worried that a direct bomb hit could destroy Alfred Gilbert's original bronze casting forever. So for years, Piccadilly Circus stood there with an empty fountain at its center, missing its most famous resident while the rest of the city braced for the Blitz. It wasn't until after the war ended that the statue was carefully reinstalled, bolted back onto its perch as if nothing had happened. Thankfully, once the war ended, the lights came back on, and Piccadilly Circus roared back to life through the 1950s and into the swinging 60s. This was peak Piccadilly. Mods and rockers cruised through on scooters, tourists gathered under Eros to people watch, and the neon signs got bigger and bolder than ever, including the iconic Coca-Cola sign that debuted in 1954. It was loud, it was bright, it was the beating heart of London youth culture. And speaking of gathering under the statue, for decades, massive crowds would pack the junction shoulder to shoulder to count down to midnight on New Year's Eve. But by the early 1960s, the crowds had gotten so large and so chaotic that police decided it simply wasn't safe anymore. So in 1962, the official New Year's countdown celebrations were shifted a short walk away to Trafalgar Square instead. And just like that, one of London's biggest annual traditions quietly moved out, leaving Piccadilly Circus to spend New Year's Eve as a supporting character instead of the main event. But like most parties, the 60s glow eventually had a come-down of its own. Because by the late 1960s and into the 70s, the area's reputation started to sour. The circus became known as a hotspot for pickpockets, drug dealers, and sex workers, and Eros himself became such a magnet for loitering and mischief that in 1985, the statue was actually relocated slightly and had protective barriers added just to stop people climbing all over it. London's most romantic monument turned into a glorified jungle gym for tourists ignoring "do not climb" signs. Antiros deserved better. That same relocation was no small task either, because the entire fountain had to be dismantled to accommodate construction work on the underground station beneath it. Engineers carefully moved it a short distance and reassembled it piece by piece, all while trying not to damage a piece of Victorian sculpture that, by that point, had survived scandal, war, and decades of tourists climbing all over it. Somehow it held together, and the version standing there today is essentially the same bronze figure that caused all that moral outrage back in 1893, just slightly repositioned and a lot more weathered. The circus wasn't done trying to entertain people, though. Because in 1989, an attraction called the Rock Circus opened right on the junction, a wax museum celebrating music legends using an audio animatronic system, meaning the wax figures could actually move and sing along to their own hits. Visitors could watch a mechanical Freddie Mercury or a robotic Elvis performing on a rotating stage. It was bizarre, it was a little unsettling, and tourists absolutely loved it for over a decade. But like most novelty attractions, the magic eventually wore off, and Rock Circus permanently closed its doors in 2001, leaving behind nothing but a weird footnote about the time London built an army of singing wax robots in the middle of its busiest junction. And speaking of things falling apart, the 1980s brought one of the ugliest fights in the circus's history, the redevelopment battle. In 1986, developer Trafalgar House proposed a massive glass and steel redevelopment of the circus, and it caused an absolute uproar. Conservationists, architects, and the public revolted, calling it a soulless glass monstrosity that would destroy the historic character of the site. Even Prince Charles reportedly weighed in against modern developments like it, famously trashing similar 80s architectural proposals elsewhere in London around the same time. So in the end, public pressure won. The glass tower plan got shelved, and Piccadilly Circus survived to keep its slightly grubby, neon-soaked charm. Democracy, but for buildings. Meanwhile, pop culture couldn't stop using Piccadilly Circus as a backdrop for chaos. The junction has shown up in countless films and television shows, almost always depicted as either bustling and glamorous or, ironically, completely deserted and post-apocalyptic. Filmmakers loved shooting scenes here specifically, because clearing out Piccadilly Circus for just a few hours felt like staging a small miracle, and showing it empty instantly signaled to audiences that something had gone catastrophically wrong with the world. Considering how packed this place normally is, an empty Piccadilly Circus became cinematic shorthand for everything is over, which, looking back at 2020, wasn't exactly wrong. And speaking of chaos, by the late 1990s and early 2000s, London had a full-blown pigeon problem, and Piccadilly Circus was ground zero. Tourists loved feeding them. Vendors sold bags of seed specifically for that purpose, and the pigeon population around the statue exploded into the thousands. The mess, the noise, and the sheer volume of birds got so bad that authorities eventually banned pigeon feeding in nearby Trafalgar Square entirely, and similar crackdowns followed around Piccadilly. So somewhere between the scandalous statue and the neon billboards, London also had to deal with an actual bird invasion, which honestly feels like the most London problem imaginable. But if you thought the drama was over, think again, because the 1990s and 2000s brought a new problem. The circus started becoming a bit of a tourist trap punchline. Guidebooks warned visitors it was underwhelming compared to the hype, basically just a busy road crossing with some big screens, and an angel statue nobody could climb anymore. And honestly, that's kind of hilarious, because for over a century this place branded itself as the hub of the entire universe, and now people were showing up going, wait, that's it. Rough way to go from icon to disappointment, but London humbled it hard. Then came the millennium, and Piccadilly Circus threw itself into the celebrations with everything it had. On December 31st, 1999, the circus lit up with special millennium displays as part of citywide festivities, and the giant advertising screens ran celebratory countdowns alongside the rest of central London gearing up for the year 2000. It was one more reminder that no matter how many scandals, wars, or redevelopment fights this junction survived, it always found its way back to being the place people gathered to mark the moment. But the 21st century also brought new headaches. As London congestion grew worse, the city introduced the congestion charge in 2003, and Piccadilly Circus, sitting right at the edge of the charging zone, became an even messier tangle of buses, taxis, and pedestrians dodging traffic. Urban planners spent years debating whether to pedestrianize parts of the junction entirely, trying to reclaim some of the space for people instead of cars. Some changes did happen, widening pavements and adjusting traffic flow, but the full pedestrian dream never quite materialized, leaving Piccadilly Circus stuck in that very London compromise. Better, but still absolute chaos. Still, the advertising legacy refused to die, and in 2017, the famous Piccadilly lights got their biggest upgrade yet. A single, massive curved digital screen replacing the old patchwork of separate billboards. It was unveiled with a dramatic countdown, switching on for the first time in years after having gone completely dark for renovation, the longest the lights had ever been switched off since World War II. And this new screen wasn't just bigger, it was smarter, capable of running targeted ads and even displaying live data like real-time weather and traffic. Piccadilly Circus, once lit by a few thousand light bulbs, now runs on the same tech as your phone. Wild glow-up, literally. But nothing could have prepared Piccadilly Circus for 2020, because when the pandemic hit, London went into lockdown, and the circus, usually one of the busiest junctions on Earth, turned into an eerie ghost town. And in a moment that felt almost poetic, the massive digital screen stopped running Coca-Cola and Samsung ads altogether, and instead displayed a single Union Jack alongside messages thanking the NHS and key workers. The hub of the universe, built on tailoring, scandal, neon capitalism, and centuries of chaos, spent its darkest modern hour just quietly saying thank you to nurses. A weirdly wholesome plot twist for a place with this much history behind it. And after that eerie emptiness, Piccadilly Circus came roaring back louder than ever. Tourism rebounded hard through 2022 and 2023. The digital screen returned to blasting ads for phones, streaming services, and tourism boards. And once again, the junction became one of the most photographed spots on the entire planet. Discussions even resurfaced about further modernizing the area, from improved pedestrian space to sustainability upgrades for the massive screen's energy use, proving that even after 4 centuries, Piccadilly Circus still can't sit still for very long. And it's not just the junction itself that has a wild history, because the buildings ringing Piccadilly Circus have their own stories too. The London Pavilion, originally built as a music hall in the 1850s, was rebuilt decades later and eventually became a cinema, hosting some of the biggest film premieres in Britain throughout the 20th century. Just next door, the Criterion Theatre has been staging plays since 1874, tucked partly underground beneath the very pavement tourists walk across every day, without realizing there's a working West End theater right under their feet. And a few steps away, the old Trocadero building went through its own identity crisis, cycling through restaurants, a concert hall, and eventually a multi-level entertainment complex packed with arcades and attractions before that too eventually closed and got redeveloped. Basically, Piccadilly Circus isn't just one landmark. It's a cluster of constantly reinventing buildings all crammed around one confused Victorian statue. Even the name, Piccadilly itself, had a strange afterlife far beyond London. Because the term became so globally associated with dazzling lights and bustling crowds, that other cities started borrowing the comparison entirely. Journalists and tourists routinely describe busy, neon-drenched intersections in cities like Tokyo or New York as looking like Piccadilly Circus, even though most of them have never actually been there. A junction that started as a joke about one tailor's fancy collars somehow became the international shorthand for extremely bright and extremely crowded, which is either the most impressive branding accident in history or genuinely deserved after 4 centuries of trying. And that brings us to today, where Piccadilly Circus is busier than ever, packed with tourists snapping photos under a statue that isn't who they think it is, standing in a circus that isn't actually a circus, in a junction that was never even supposed to look like this in the first place. 400 years, one collar-selling tailor, one nude statue scandal, 2 world wars, a swinging 60s glow-up, an 80s architectural rebellion, a millennium countdown, and a pandemic thank you message later, and somehow it's still standing. Honestly, for something that started as a joke about someone's fancy collar, that's not a bad legacy at all.